I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, and I'm the lead psychologist for the Coventry and Warwickshire Eating Disorder Service, which is very new because we only launched last week for across the whole patch. So it's all very new. I will be that until July, in which I'm gone. And some other deserving soul can have that job title.
Well, Ken, I'm delighted to have you here and to be able to share all that you've done, which has been amazing work on helping people with eating disorders through the compassion-focused therapy model. You just published a paper with a bunch of other people. It's fabulous. So tell us about the paper.
It's been a long time coming. So we began, I think, about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago, doing a randomized control trial with our colleagues in Norway. So I developed the compassion-focused therapy for eating disorder side of the program. A wonderful colleague called Glenn Waller, who is very big in the CBT for eating disorder as well, developed the CFT-E protocol. And then our colleagues ran that as a randomized control trial in an inpatient unit in Norway. And their inpatient units are really interesting compared to the UK units, where mainly people will come in one at a time, if you like, when they're ill. They've got very much a cohort-based model for most of their therapies, actually, for adults and children, for all sorts of mental health difficulties. And they had this one for eating disorders. So we spent some time training the staff team, getting the supervision up. They were already very good at CBT, so that was great. So then we got the protocol up and running. We ran that for about 3 and a bit years in the end. I supervise them probably once a fortnight. So we tried to make sure that new staff knew the model. Then kind of COVID got in the way from when we were going to produce the outcome paper, as it did for everybody. So they had the same struggles that all of us clinicians have worldwide, of how do they carry on delivering treatments and everything else. So finally, Carrie-Anne Vrabel, who is led on the paper and has done an amazing job of pulling together lots of different pieces of information, got the paper out last month. And we're delighted. It shows what we'd expected, Glenn and I, which is different people seem to respond to the different therapies slightly differently. But if you've got a complex trauma, it looks like CFT-E is probably the better option, at least a year after. So we seem to maintain and increase progress about a year after discharge. But people are about the same from both therapies at the end of their 6 months, 3 to 6 months worth of work, clinical work as an inpatient. But actually, it seems that for the trauma-based work, CFT-E is a way to go, is probably the way to go at the moment, based on that, obviously, one trial of when we need to replicate and have more. So that was very exciting. So the week that paper came out, then my PhD student, who is Christiana Marquez, who's absolutely brilliant, also has been publishing a number of papers for her PhD. So I think almost the same week, her paper came out, which looked at online compassion-focused therapy for people with overeating as a difficult. So people presenting for weight management, often with binge eating disorder. Again, she got some amazing results, including some interesting changes in brain functioning. So she'd had MRI, HRV studies, as well as the group outcome data. So it's been a very exciting last couple of months, given we haven't published much in the way of outcome for a while, and then a bit like buses, two come along at once. So I'm sitting here feeling quite pleased with quite a lot of other people's work, which I happen to have kind of supervised and been involved in, and maybe kind of help them along their way. So I'd love to take all the credit for it, but that would be both narcissistic and wrong. It's always with these things a great team effort, and gratitude to our patients who were prepared to sign up for the various trials as well, because without them, trials don't happen. We don't learn about what can work and what works for who. So I guess the good news is we know it's great for the eating disorder symptomatology, but also it does seem to have a significant impact on people's ability to be give and receive compassion, including self-compassion, and on shame and self-criticism. So the things we wanted it to work for, that we designed it for, it seems to do what we liked it to do, or would have liked it to do.
Well, it's pretty amazing to have people inpatient a year later continue to see.
Yeah, I mean, their research ethic at Modem is amazing, and their ability to engage patients and keep doing follow-up. I think says something about the quality of care that they offer and how much patients appreciate it, but also just the sheer level of perseverance of kind of following people up, because that's really hard. I mean, when we're
Right.
doing the clinical audit, it's tough to get people to kind of follow
So
up.
what do you think was is there a key difference? What can we narrow it down to specifics?
I think so. I think certainly if we think about what seems to be the thing that makes the biggest difference is helping people develop capacities for compassion. We know that our eating disorder populations and our overeating populations share pretty much the same psychological difficulties in relation to both eating disorder thoughts and feelings, but also shame and self-criticism. So, and big problems with compassion. So a while back, Alison Kelly's done some amazing work looking at what stops people getting well on units. Even if the unit is very good and kind of world renowned, the ability to receive compassion or use compassion to be helpful to the self, or compassion from others to help kind of engage in therapy, and high levels of shame are almost perfect predictors of doing badly in therapy. So you can spend 12 months 12 weeks in a unit, and get no real change other than maybe some eating change because people want to eat themselves out of a ward. But on the whole, they really predict whether people are going to do well psychologically and stay well. So I think it is that working with shame, the working with the self-criticism, developing the capacity for compassion as a motivational system. Because most of eating disorder work is learning to care for the self in a different way, rather than using your eating disorder to kind of help you manage worries about shape and weight or emotions.
Tell me about the difference that you're seeing there. I think people would be really interested in that.
Yeah. So I guess the biggest difference for us is probably we're thinking about how people come into our group work, because most of the work I do is in group. And that was originally expedient. We just didn't have enough staff. We had too many patients. So groups were a way to go. But actually, over time, what our patients tell us is group work is better for them. They kind of find the social isolation and the shame that goes with having an eating disorder really crippling, and they won't talk to people outside. They've often taken decades to even ask for professional help. So I guess the first thing for us is people just come in absolutely terrified of other people. If you have an eating disorder, it's very shaming, or it's very competitive. So you come in, but you think other people are going to be just as competitive about size and shape as you are, which of course they are. So beginning to help people de-shame some of that experience of just help seeking is kind of really important. The next thing that what we find is that our eating disorder population tend to motivate themselves through self-criticism. So if they're struggling with eating, what they'll do is really beat themselves up about eating. So if you're not kept to a diet that day, they'll frighten the lives out of themselves with all the horrible things about them or what might happen to them or what other people might do, because they're a bad person because they can't maintain a shape or weight or a pattern of eating that they want to maintain. So a lot of their motivational system when they come in is fear-based. And I guess for me, beginning to move that to a compassion-based motivational system to engage with looking after your body and your emotions in a different way, that's the big shift. And Deborah Lee showed some fantastic work when they looked about what helped with their trauma clients, of showing that shift from kind of self-critical, fear-based motivation through to gradually becoming less fearful of compassion, more able to receive and tolerate positive emotions towards the self, gradually easing out of self-criticism as a motivational influence, and not only motivate themselves for eating disorder recovery, but for long-term looking after their mental and physical well-being. So we find big changes, not just in, oh, I don't have an eating disorder anymore, because there's a little story I tell all of our clients, which is eating disorder recovery is really easy. I can do it in 24 hours. Yeah, all you have to let me do is put you in a coma. I'll feed you enough food to make you body well. If we manage your sleep cycles, you're probably not even going to have that many eating disorder thoughts and dreams. but it's not a life. And for me, compassion focused therapy is about learning to live a good life, a life that is meaningful, that means you can contribute, means you can be cared for and care for others. So we find that that's what happens over time. Our eating disorder patients become much more engaged, not just with caring for themselves, but much more pro-social and much more connected. And I guess the other thing, alongside working with the self-critical system, is many of our eating disorder patients only get a sense of achievement, a sense of satisfaction from behaviors designed to achieve weight loss. So a lot of those other things in, their drive basket, if you like, is relatively empty. They don't have a lot of fun things that are for fun other than seeing the weight go down on the scales. So, and there's often a lot of pride in the ability to have eating disorder behaviors, particularly when people are inpatients, because there's an awful lot of pride in defeating your therapist and that rebellion.
And defeating the others on the unit.
Yeah. The others on the unit, but mainly the therapists. Because we're making them do stuff that's fearful, they don't want to do, they don't want to engage with. So it's understandable. If you made me give up being a psychologist, which I get a fair amount of my drive comes from doing the day job, if you said you can never do that again, you can never have the joy that comes from the work that you do, I'd fight you every step of the way too. So I think understanding that kind of response to hanging on to a drive system that gives you something good in the world, something you can control, something you can achieve. And a lot of the work is beginning to replace that. So we're moving away from self-criticism as a motivational system, moving towards other things that feed our drive system. And that's one of our early homeworks. Go do something, find something you can do that's fun, that isn't about your eating disorder. Ideally with other people, but if not, on your own. And then I guess the final shift is into being able to access soothing, to calm the body and mind. And that's some of Christiana's finding some great data looking at what happens in our frontal cortex, of how that begins to settle, how HRV improves, and people are more emotionally flexible. So that physiotherapy for the brain part is really important in compassion focused therapy for eating disorder. We kind of look for people to practice around about 30 minutes a day, but mainly because they do things that are fun and enjoyable, and occasionally they'll use it in earnest when they're struggling. So we want to build that part of the brain up, and we do seem to do what we want, what we're looking for from therapy.
Do you give them structured practices, Ken, or you have them find what they want to do?
It's an interesting mixture. So in group work, it's a little trickier than individual because you don't know your patients very well. So you don't know what really kind of rocks their boat. So we have a cooking spaghetti approach, which is we chuck enough up, and when it sticks against the wall, we know that that's what they're going to use.
Right.
Sorry, eating disorders get a lot of food analogies. So effectively what we do is we have a whole range of soothing system practices, and we do teach distraction in the very short term for affect management, but we move towards soothing as quickly as we can. So we teach practical self-soothing. We found that breathing exercises with eating disorder patients didn't go down well, because as soon as you start to focus on the breath, you focus on your tummy. Not a good idea for people who are preoccupied with size and shape. We get there, but we start with practical exercises. So we often do show and tell. We find things that they can smell, touch, look at, that get them into their soothing system. Once we've got some practical things we can do, we then try and turn that into memory so they can kind of remember doing it, because many of our clients have a very difficult relationship with soothing memories, and often it is just around food. So we kind of build that system up. Then people notice that their breathing changes. So we go, oh, that's interesting. Why don't we look at doing breath and see if we do breath? And our patients really find hard to sit still. And that's often a natural response to eating more. Your body just wants to move. So we practice soothing, breathing, seated, standing, and then soothing walking. Because I think being in the body is great. If I had someone who knew what they were doing with Tai Chi and yoga, I would also have that as part of our program. And I know in some other parts of the world that is part of standard eating disorder treatment. It's just not really something that we do much of in the UK, because I really think linking body as a positive experience is really important. So we do suggest that people might want to try that out if they think it might be useful. So a lot of people end up doing slow versions of yoga or Tai Chi, as well as some of the things we recommend. And then we do our standard compassionate mind work of practice being a compassionate person in the real world, and then some imagery work around. We use two really, mainly Me at My Best and compassionate companion work. When people find what works for them, and we spend about 2 weeks training that really, so they have all day for 4 days over 2 weeks just to get the skills in place. Once they're in place, then they use what they find helpful for them. So we take let's try everything. You only need 1 or 2 things to work for you, one thing that's soothing, one thing that gets your compassionate mind working, and then you're done. And then often when we've got compassionate minds working, we do quite a lot of letter work, writing work. And again, our letter writing is quite structured because it literally maps all of the elements of each of our group therapy sessions. So effectively, they have a very familiar way of writing a letter, which is exactly the same as we do a therapy session. So they can kind of mirror therapy at home. So we are quite structured in the idea that they practice, and we do ask them to keep a record of what they do and what's useful. But once they've got what they find helpful, then we leave it up to them.
That's great. Ken, when you do the inpatient, how many weeks is it?
So I think, and this is a top of my head stuff because the last time I supervised this team was almost 3 years ago. So I think it was about 16 weeks. So they have a quite intensive first 2 or 3 months, then they come back for some top-up weeks, because the way that the system works in Norway is the state pays for inpatient residential, but not for outpatient. So they try and get people as well as they can and come back to the unit to kind of work on kind of blocks and resistances when they're outpatient. And then kind of it's then up to individuals to sort their therapy out. That's what I remember. Mm-hmm. Of course, my memory could be wrong, and I'm sure Carrie Ann will correct me at some point.
Well, and also if people are doing this outpatient, or can they do it on their own, or are there therapists that they can talk to about it individually?
So I guess, I mean, I work in the National Health Service, and I don't see patients privately. Christiana's study population were people who've been referred to adult weight management services. So my experience of the kind of researchy stuff is it tends to be public, because therapy is not cheap. But we started out running group programs, and we have our way of doing things. Clodagh Dowling, who is doing amazing work in Dublin, they have a slightly different approach because they're more private. So they take a wider population of patients into their groups. So we don't take people with binge eating disorder or compulsive eating, simply because our service isn't funded to do that. It's not that we can't work, we're just not funded to do it. Hence my guilt trip book of the 2011 book that I'm busy rewriting a different version of. So you can have groups that are mixed. You can have groups that are single. We had a couple of years where we had a low weight only group, and that lasted a year. So it's a lot longer. Our normal group program, start to finish, is about 6 months from when you assess to when you finish. So that was longer, and we had better outcomes with that. But a lot of my team are doing individual protocols with adults, because actually in the severe part of our service, it's quite hard to make people wait for a group. So they have an individual track, and just been on a great trip to Denmark to train some colleagues over there who are going to be looking at how they do this with young people and working with families. So I think there's lots of different ways to do it. The modality is less important than the protocol, I think. So we have a very clear protocol. Think jobs you need to do compassion focused therapy for eating disorders. And it is a lot more prescriptive than the other types of CFT that I do, because if people don't eat, their brain doesn't function well enough to get well. So there is a lot of emphasis on helping people eat regularly, eat enough, and gradually learning to eat the foods they're worried about, learning to manage thoughts and feelings about weight, which does mean we have to weigh people. So there's a lot of stuff that's a lot more prescriptive. It's very standard in eating disorder treatment, but it's a lot more prescriptive than standard CFT. So it is more or differently challenging than, say, the work I've done with people with depression or anxiety or trauma. So it's a very different kind of way of working, and it is a lot more prescriptive, which does mean that we end up often being in a slightly different relational stance with our clients than other ways we do CFT.
And when it's prescriptive, because it seems like so much eating disorder is related, like you said, to comfort and to the places where they haven't received comfort. And they're like their body, mind, and heart doesn't know what comfort is.
Absolutely.
And so how, from an attachment point of view, I'm thinking that there's a lot of underlying issues. And
absolutely.
And so you deal with that later once you lay down the main protocol?
Yeah. So I think, well, we deal with that within the protocol anyway. And there will be some people who need to go on to additional work for either complex interpersonal trauma or attachment trauma. So it's not like, oh, if you do this, you sort everything out. But what we do find is the same, again, very similar findings to the things that Deborah Lee found, which is if you do a lot of the CFT stuff and build the brain capacity, the trauma work is a lot quicker, or sometimes doesn't need to be done much at all. It may be a 1 or 2 session afterwards, kind of just sorting things through. So it's not that we deal with it, but it's not the main focus. Whereas if you're in other types of CFT, for example, that relational and interpersonal trauma will be your main focus of your work. And our dilemma is that if people are in a biological state of starvation, which is anything more than about 3 hours without food, and have been doing that for a long time, they can't think properly anyway. Their brain just atrophies. Quite literally, they're flooding their brain with cortisol and fear all the time. And they're malnourished, which all basically limits our ability to regulate affect. So we have to kind of get those physiological building blocks in relatively quickly, which is why our skills program is very intense. I mean, it's 6 days in 3 weeks, which last week is meal planning, just to get people kind of going. We found if we left it a lot longer, people just got a lot iller and didn't really change very much. So
and what about overeaters?
quite labor intensive.
Is that different?
Kind of, but not really. We've done a lot of primary research looking at how do overeaters' brains work and kind of how do they think. And in terms of the problems with cortical functioning, Christiana's found it works just the same as in anorexic patients, because actually a lot of people who overeat put themselves through starvation for long periods during the day, and they're all often really worried about gaining weight. They've got the double whammy that if you're overweight, you're going to also experience active stigma from the world too. So once you get to a BMI of about 30, 35, people notice. Once you get to 40, people are cruel. Literally will drive past you and abuse you in the street for your weight and shape. Very practical things like getting on a plane becomes really, stigmatizing and traumatic. So a lot of the stuff is the same. The psychoeducation around our tricky bodies and our tricky brains work is similar. And interestingly enough, for those folks too, we're looking at eating regularly, eating enough for your current weight, which won't be 2,000 calories. For some people, their current weight will mean they need 3,500 calories. And then getting the emotion out of eating, so it can still be enjoyable, but you get you get comfort from other places. And it's the same as everything else in CFT. You have to build something else so that people have got an alternative. If you don't build the other stuff first and you try and change symptoms too early, people are going to go back to what's familiar. Because, what else do you do? If the only thing that's ever going to make you feel in any way comforted is a binge, and you've got no other way to do that at all, well, why on earth would you give up binging? Frightening you about the health considerations 20 years down the line is not going to do the trick.
Right.
And as soon as we start motivating people by fear, we've lost. Fear-based motive just does not work. You can I can frighten anybody into doing what I want them to do until I'm not around anymore. So if I take your family hostage and, threaten to harm them because if you don't eat your meal plan, then of course you're going to eat your meal plan. chances are when I release your family, you're going to not eat your meal plan. You're probably going to come back and kill me if you've got any sense. So fear-based motivation doesn't really work. And neither does that very rational, well, if you do this, you're going to be unhealthy, because actually immediate short-term comfort is way better than worrying about whether I might get diabetes 30 years from now.
Right.
So I think that whole bit of shifting motivational systems is key to the overeating, undereating, the binge purge patterns of eating. Most people who have an eating disorder swap symptoms. At least 50%, 60% of them will have different eating disorder diagnoses over time. And the traditional pattern is restriction to bulimia to binge eating and then being overweight. You might go the other way around. So people are people are people. Your weight and the strategies you use will be the things you can get away with or you think are going to work at the time. But underneath it all is this idea that, size and shape is the most important thing about you, or very important about you. People are going to be cruel to you if you don't fit in. And you're then in that double whammy of food might also be comforting. So it's a threat and a comfort at the same time, which is why recovery from an eating disorder is so hard, because it pushes you at a biological level, but also at a psychological level. And to a certain extent, we have to help our clients be superhuman when they leave therapy. Because if you think that certainly in the UK, about 50% of women at any one time are on a diet, it's getting closer and closer for men. And if when they're not on a diet, then they're, doing all sorts of other compulsive activity, which is probably linked to wanting to be healthy, but probably isn't, or might be about psychological management of emotions. We're not really good at helping people build good relationships with their body
or themselves,
and there is a big
their
industry,
inner world,
or themselves, or their inner world. And unlike some of our other addictions, this is a publicly endorsed, very well funded, very well advertised, and often with some very unwise messages from our government and some of their health organizations about what health looks like, because it's all around weight and BMI. And really, health is not about anything to do with that, really. It's to do with cardiovascular fitness and your balance of macro and micronutrients and how much sleep you get and how much rest you get, and how much muscle you're carrying or not. All of which is achievable whether or not you gain or lose 5 or 10 pounds.
And this is,
but we don't measure that.
I think it's so helpful how you talk about it on the very specific level. The paper is one thing, but your wealth of knowledge about all sorts of parts of the eating disorder hugely important for people. So I cannot wait to share this with everyone. And you're going to send me that. I'll put all the resources.
I'll put some links in. I've just finished some teaching, so the good news is the links are up to date, or at least the kind of references are up to date. I'm hoping the next version of Overeating, or kind of a newer version of the Overcoming Overeating book that I did in 2011, which makes me feel slightly old, which was Paul Gilbert's guilt trip for me. So basically, I moaned to him a lot about saying, look, we're not allowed to help people who overeat. And he said, that's nonsense. That you can do what you like. Which means do like, well, if you're not allowed to do it at work, why don't you write a book? Oh, yeah. He's good at that.
Yeah.
But I think there's that bit of, actually, I think my big hope for the papers is that compassion-focused therapy for eating disorders becomes more mainstream. In the UK, you have to be on something called NICE guidelines. We're in the NICE guidelines for Scotland. We were in NICE guidelines, the first one that came out, and then the second edition we weren't in. So I'm hoping that the thing that the randomized and then the waiting list control paper will do, that have just come out, will kind of add to that weight of evidence, saying, look, actually have a look at this therapy. It might be helpful for some of the people you see, particularly the ones who are very self-critical and ashamed and who can't tolerate compassionate therapy, which, CBT is a compassionate therapy, but it requires you to be able to kind of receive compassion from your therapist or not motivate yourself through your threat system. So I think what I'm hoping for is that we'll have a more diverse range of approaches out there to help people, rather than, it's this competition for who's the best therapy, which is often where we get put. For me, it's, what's the best therapy for the person coming to your door? And if they've got a lot of shame, if they've got a lot of self-criticism, if they really struggle with self-compassion and receiving compassion from others, including their therapist, then I think this is worth giving people a go to, because it has pretty good outcomes now, which is nice. It's only 30 years of work to kind of get to that point, but hey ho.
Right. That's why you're here. That's a perfect way to end. So thank you.
And thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting today.